The Sahel is a subject of great interest for the international community because of the fragility and the worsening security situation, which tends to jeopardize the development prospects of this region. Afflicted by a combination of armed conflict, terrorism, extreme weather conditions and economic instability, the region has been at the centre of international political talks because of these security concerns and the many development challenges.
The
situation in Sahel depends on the security issues in the region. And to this regard, it is obvious that the concerned countries cannot solve the problem by themselves. According to our own observations, they have to be supported because jihadists are more and more audacious. Now they can even attack the armed forces with a lot of damage every time. In addition to these terrorist groups who reign with terror and murder, you have also the conflicts between different communities living together, and that's one of the main challenges. We saw that in northern Mali, in Niger and Burkina Faso. Up north, we saw a kind of light of hope with the return of the Malian armed forces inside Kizal, which was very important. They also went back to Timbuktu and Taudenit and are about to go back to Menaka. And this is a very good news, which means that the Malian people, with what is called the inclusive dialogue, have succeeded in taking up together common resolutions and applying them together, the Algiers agreements.
Et à relire ensemble, collectivement, ce qu'on appelle les accords d'Alger.
When you see the center of Mali, when you see how the Chad Lake Basin is getting smaller and smaller, added to the decrease of resources which increases community conflicts, you realize that these tensions together with the non-mastered demographic growth are realities to be taken into account. If today we want consistent and sustainable solutions to this Sahelian crisis, which is getting more and more serious.
As terrorist attacks multiply in the Sahel despite a large military presence, leaders of affected countries are calling for a greater intervention from the United Nations. In recent months, attacks have multiplied in several military bases and against the population in Mali, Niger and even Burkina Faso. The Bamako Forum is a space for reflection, the sharing of experiences and points of views on the major issues affecting the African continent. The 20th edition of the forum was held from February 20th to 22nd under the theme Which Africa for 2040. The objective was to put in place solutions to demographic, technological and climate challenges and the consolidation of peace and security, as well as the inclusive and sustainable development in Africa.
The 20 years anniversary of the forum have been full of jolts, but were quite interesting as well. As a matter of fact, we made a lot of movements throughout Africa in terms of territory development, infrastructure, agriculture, education, health, economy and finance, etc. But now it's time to take a stop and ask the question, which Africa do we want by the horizon 2040? And one of the answers is that by that date we are dreaming for a peaceful Africa where it's good to live and in where children are happy and prosperous. It's a dream. And in this environment, when they leave their continent, it will be just for vacation and come back to Africa because they will be at ease at theirs.
C'est pour aller se prélasser et revenir chez eux parce qu'ils sont bien chez eux.
On the sidelines of this forum, the regional office of the United Nations Population Fund for West and Central Africa, the UNFPA, organised the session on demography, peace and security. The purpose of the conference was to provide a platform on the relationship between demographic change and the occurrence of armed conflict.
It was quite normal to have a talk about the future of Africa by 2040 and try to make a correlation between the demographic questions as we have one of the highest demographic growth in the world, and where we have endless crises, and where the security challenges are getting more and more serious and the public debate. So having discussions on the future of Africa here in Bamako would mean to discuss all these issues. The second point is how to build a dialogue between all the counterparts. This would allow to put all the components together, realize data and evidence in order to see to what extent these empirical data can be useful for the issue.
While the immediate causes of the security instability is due to youth unemployment, the scarcity of resources, high level of social inequalities and poor governance, the demographic factor is increasingly a factor. These conflicts take place in a social context marked by a very low demographic transition, which results in strong population growth.
De façon empirique, il a été démontré que
empirical studies have demonstrated that the younger the population is, the more these youths are tempted to involve in violence as a means to solve conflicts. To say it down to earth, youth have generally a hot blood. The other point is that youth are the greatest victims of underdevelopment and bad governance. They constitute a demographic majority and a sociologic minority in our countries because in most of the cases, governments don't attribute them what should be their right place. And in countries where most of governance systems don't correspond to population's expectations, I don't say it's normal, but it's understandable that the youth try to find elsewhere solutions to their own needs and questions.
Les moyens de répondre à leurs besoins.
Il faut d'abord se rendre compte de la limite.
We have to understand that the military responses have some limits. Like they say, a weapon has never killed an ideology. The ideology which is hiding behind jihadism should be fought through education and health, that is to say, massive investment through human capital, through taking into account local realities and youth involvement, like in some great United Nations resolutions, the 2050, or with women in the 3025. There is also the point regarding taking into account local realities when elaborating public policies, but there is also an important point, which is not to forget about the important correlation between demographic pressure, resources management and conflicts which are increasing in the region.
La gestion des ressources et la conflictualité qui augmente dans la région.
The UNFPA's goal is to encourage African countries to empower women and capitalize on youth. The demographic dividend is described by the United Nations Population Fund as an increase in economic productivity that occurs when the ratio of the labour force to the number of dependents increases. Capturing this demographic dividend will enable sustainable and inclusive development everywhere on the continent, and more particularly in the most vulnerable Sahelian zone.
When working in the theme, we hesitated a lot. It was about whether to go with demographic dividend, peace and security, or whether to go with demography, peace and security only. I think that if the situation the Sahelian countries are living doesn't stop, capturing the demographic dividend in this region will be much more difficult to reach. That's the reason why I think the international community should come at the rescue of Africa, so that when it is time to reinforce the military response, countries should be accompanied for a humanitarian response. This is so because there are so many people whose survival depends on this international humanitarian assistance and whose countries don't have the fiscal space. The third point, which is important for the international partnership, is that the investments in development, and we have to say it, aren't up to date, because today it is to save populations and guarantee security in order to have a more favorable international cooperation.
This session of the forum is to trigger concerted action in response to humanitarian and development challenges in the region. The next steps will constitute the monographs review that have been discussed and the review of the white paper, which will pave the way to another meeting at a symposium in Dakar. This symposium will be to establish and implement a strategy to elaborate a definitive action plan in order to respond to the challenges encountered in the Sahel countries and beyond. In Mali, 85% of women are victims of gender-based violence, according to statistics from the Ministry of Women, Children and Family Promotion. The 3 one-stop centre in Bamako, which are a link between the law and Malian women having suffered from gender-based violence, is a logistics unit managed by the Ministry of Health and Public Hygiene, supported by the UNFPA. The rehabilitation centre offers security, psychological and gynecological assistance services. The beneficiaries are survivors of gender-based violence.
Le premier type de violence rencontrée, c'est surtout les agressions sexuelles.
The first type of violence is sexual harassment, and in general we face a lot of types of sexual harassment on girls under 18. These cases of paedophilia, and generally the guilty is a parent or relative to the girl who is victims of his actions. In addition to that, the legal procedure is problematic. In the centre we have the medical taking in charge process, the psychological assistance, the security assistance, as well as the legal assistance. The principles of this centre are respect and confidentiality, because if the victim feels respected and is aware of the confidentiality with which she is treated, she feels confident to speak, and knowing this also helps her feel legally safe and to make her feel better.
Qui accompagne les survivantes.
C'est le type de centre, je pense qu'il faut dans tous les coins.
We need this type of center everywhere in Mali and all the other countries of the sub-region. So this is an important part of the disposal, which has to be quickly completed by the adoption of a law on gender-based violence. And I think Mali has to go faster in these domains and take example from other countries of the sub-region who have made consistent efforts in this regard by putting in place complete legal mechanisms without which it wouldn't be certainly possible to win the fight against gender-based violence.
Mali is one of the 8 beneficiary countries of the Spotlight Initiative, promoted by the European Union and the United Nations. Its aim is to eliminate all forms of violence against women and girls. The initiative draws attention to the issue of gender-based violence by crystallising it and placing it at the heart of efforts to achieve gender equality and women empowerment, in line with the Sustainable Development Agenda of Horizon 2030. Recently, the UNFPA provided equipment worth some 152 billion CFA francs for better care of survivors and beneficiaries.
En tant que ministre en charge de la promotion de la femme, de l'enfant et de la famille,
as the Minister in charge of Women, Children and Family, I fully appreciate this initiative of the United Nations systems, and more precisely by the UNFPA, because as you know, gender-based violence is among the greatest challenges of my department, and this initiative has come to fight against these practices, so I really appreciate the action.
Le financement de l'UNFPA.
The UNFPA is supporting the action of the Department of Health to complete this package of services provided, mainly the reproductive health aspect. So we're really glad today to know that many secondary centers will be created in order to take into account gender-based violence in Mali, mainly in areas which have been affected by the crisis. And as you know, women, children and adolescents are the most affected by these crises.
The education level in Mali is one of the lowest in Africa. Although the government is committed to providing access to quality education for all children and a steady increase in school enrollment rates, the situation for girls is even more difficult than for boys. The gross primary school enrollment rate is 80%, with 70.7% of girls. However, less than 37% of girls reach 9 years of compulsory schooling. Girls' dropout rates, especially in secondary school, are very high. Parents often do not have the means to keep their children in school. As part of the education programme for girls and young women in Mali, supported by the Republic of South Korea, UN Women organised a 1-month intensive tutoring course for girls and boys for 7 communities in Bamako. During the 4 weekends of May 2018, 1,007 girls and boys from poor families in Bamako were tutored for the National High School exam. Fatoumata Kanta is one of them. She was saved from forced marriage and she finally graduated through the involvement of the joint UNESCO, UNFPA and UN Women project.
J'étais à ma tante. Bon, j'ai fait le retour à mon village pour voir les parents.
I was at my aunt's, but I had to go back to my village in order to stay with my parents. and then a man saw me there and asked to marry me. I told him no, I want to study, but he didn't listen to me and went straight to see my parents. He didn't even ask me about what I thought. So I ran away and I went to see my brother in Messina, and I told him that I want to continue my studies. He told me he couldn't afford that. However, I listened to the radio and heard about the NGO, and I went to see Mr. Koulibaly to tell him about my situation. He promised to help me and took me to school as a beginner. Later on, I started my studies in the secretarial office, and this year I'm in my second year. Fatoumata started her training in November 2018. She joined a college in Bamako, a step forward to achieve her dream. As a matter of fact, the success she obtained convinced her family about her abilities.
According to me, forced marriage is not good. Young girls should be allowed to continue their studies. Personally, I don't like forced marriage. Even for us, the men, having educated wives could help us have a more educated family. So it's an advantage for us. So let's put an end to this practice.
I don't like forced marriages. As you can see in our society, women don't have the right to speak up. Men decide for young girls' marriages. Personally, I want my daughter to study, and when she'll find her way, it will be to the advantage of our family. In doing so, she'll be able to take care of herself and her family. For me, studies are of paramount importance. Marriage will come later, but now it's time for studies. This is my point of view regarding this problem, which is prevailing in our society. The fight against gender-based violence goes beyond Mali. In Chad, some 100 kilometers from the capital N'Djamena, in Mani, some 1,412 women in 82 groups meet regularly in the village square to pool their know-how and develop income-generating activities. The objective is about women empowerment. With a salary of 2,000 CFA francs per hectare ploughed, the Mani female tractor operators have acquired notoriety beyond the borders of their village.
Le gouvernement, avec le projet Suède, a fait vraiment des miracles au Tchad dans sa phase pilote.
The government of Chad, with the SWED project, has made some miracles here in our country. We're speaking about the Africa for 2040, and that Africa will be for the young girls of today, who will be in charge of developing the continent. And hopefully, with the SWED project, the government has supported 10,000 young girls who are in vulnerable situations by guaranteeing school fees for them, school kits and scholarships and so on. The advantage is that all these young girls are maintained at school until the end of their secondary cycle. Last year, for example, 100 girls got their baccalaureate. This project is just the pilot phase, and 500 women from 365 groups benefited from technical and financial support. 112 among them have been trained in operating heavy engines, such as tractors and the like, while these jobs were only done by men before. They also carry out maintenance, and today they are autonomous and empowered and monitor themselves in all their activities. A great number of them have also been trained in the maintenance of renewable and solar energy. So now they excel in the installation of solar panels in Chad. Initially present in 7 countries, namely Burkina Faso, Ivory Coast, Mali, Mauritania, Niger and Chad, the Women's Empowerment and Demographic Dividend in the Sahel project, known as SWED, is funded by the World Bank, under the supervision of sectorial ministries, with the coordination of the UNFPA and the support from the West African Health Organization. In Chad, more than 13,000 vulnerable young girls have received support in the form of a school kit, accommodation, payment of school fees and school support.